Okay, so in our last little clip, we talked about some sources of law, okay, and our main focus was on legislatures. Legislatures seem to be the main lawmaking body, and there are legislatures at all levels. There's a national legislature, Congress, there are state legislatures, and then there are even local boards that pass ordinances, okay? Well, what we're going to look at today, how do they do that? Okay. How do legislatures function? And again, we're going to use broad strokes here. Okay. Kind of give you an overall picture. And then as we move through the semester, we will come back to this and get into a little bit more detail. Okay. Now, number one, Congress cannot legislate unless given the power to do so in the Constitution. Okay. So that's where Congress gets its power, is the Constitution. And if Congress violates any of its power given by the Constitution, then a law could be considered unconstitutional. Okay? So Congress gets its power from the Constitution. It's got to abide by that power. State legislatures, okay, which again deal with issues within the boundary of the state, they get their power from the national government. Okay? And basically, they have the power to regulate issues that are not granted to the National Congress by the Constitution. Okay, so states have the power to legislate in all those areas over which the national government has not been granted power by the Constitution. Okay, and then we talked about in the last session, the states then in turn give power to the local legislatures, okay, boards of education, that sort of thing. All right. And it's important that each level respects the power of the others, okay? Because if they step out of bounds, like I said, if they step out of bounds, their legislation, their efforts could be considered unconstitutional, okay? Now, how do these legislatures work? All right. Well, actually, before we get to that, why do we put so much effort and so much time in talking about Congress? Okay. Well, it has to do with the Constitution and something in the Constitution called the Supremacy Clause. Okay. Be sure you get this definition down. The Supremacy Clause of the Constitution states that the Constitution and the laws of the United States are the supreme law of the land. So that's why we spend a lot of time talking about the Constitution. That's why we spend a lot of time talking about Congress, since Congress makes the laws, because according to the Constitution, they are the supreme law of the land. And we've already talked about the fact that their legislation has national impact. It is binding to all the states. And all the other levels, the state level and the local level, get their powers from what is not given to not given to Congress by the Constitution. Okay, so that's why we spend so much time at the national level, because it is the law of the land, and they pass laws dealing with national impact. Okay, Congress has sometimes passed laws about topics that are the proper focus of the states, and they do get declared unconstitutional. So don't think that Congress has the power to just completely abuse the Constitution. It has gotten called on the carpet several times because the laws that it passes are really state issues. And if somebody appeals and it goes to the Supreme Court and the appeal wins, those laws are declared unconstitutional. There are a few topics that both the federal and state governments have power in. For example, criminal law. I've been mentioning that one, that there are issues that both the state and national government have jurisdiction over. Okay, and one of those is criminal law. Now, how do we get laws made? Okay, we made a big deal about the legislature being the lawmaking body. How do laws get made? All right. Legislation is introduced as a bill. You need to get that term down. Legislation is introduced as a bill. It is used to enact new laws or to amend or repeal old laws. Okay, so a bill, this is probably a bad illustration, but a bill is a suggestion. It's got to go through the process. It's got to be voted on. And if the bill goes through the process and the bill is voted on, then it becomes a law. Okay, so this is kind of the pre-law stage. It's a suggestion. Now, where do we get these bills? They can come from legislatures. They can come from an individual. They can come from the president, the executive branch. They can come from the citizens or citizen groups. Okay. If the people think we need to have this protected, it could come from citizens. You often see that at the state level. Okay. And by the way, we're going to focus on the national level, but a similar procedure is used at the state level as well. Okay. You introduce a bill and then you vote on it at the state level. We saw this in Virginia with, there's a lot of hunting bills out there, okay, dealing with hunting season and things like that, that are more state issues than national issues. Well, a lot of those, we want to protect hunting season and things like that. That legislation comes from citizens. Citizens feel it's important, so they're the ones that suggest it. Okay, businesses can suggest bills. When in history class we talk about industrialization, okay, and we talk about unsafe working conditions and child labor and things like that. When businesses realize we need to be safe, a lot of the protections that we take for granted today as consumers, a lot of those suggestions either came from individuals or came from businesses. Okay. We don't want to kill our customers. We want to keep them safe. We want to keep our workers safe. Okay. And then of course you've got lobbyists for specific interest groups. Okay. And there's a lot of criticism about lobbyists, that a lot of times they are not, they, instead of being impartial, of course that's the whole purpose, is to be partial toward their cause, but a lot of times they kind of abuse their power and things like that. So lobbyists are kind of controversial. Okay. All right. Now, if a bill is passed by the legislature and is not vetoed by the executive branch, it becomes a law. Once it becomes a law, like I said, a bill is a suggestion. It's kind of the pre-law phase. Once it becomes a law, the people must obey it. Okay. Now, oftentimes the language of the law is opening to differing interpretations. Okay. We saw that with Plessy versus Ferguson. And I will say that part of the power of our government and part of the strength of our government, I think, if a law is passed that the people think is not fair, they need to say something about it. They need to appeal it. Now, it's not going to be an easy process, okay, because we're dealing with law. Creating law is not an easy process, okay? I'll be honest with you, and we'll talk more about this for my hybrid kids. We're going to talk more about this week when you do your presentations. That's why I had you do that desert island presentation, is because you guys don't realize how much work it takes to construct a law, okay? Because if it's something important that you want to see protected, you want to be sure that it's worded in a way that everybody can understand, but in a way that is not going to seem unfair, so that people will not want to obey it, okay? And that's part of the reason I had you working to create laws within your society, okay? All right, so back to the appeals process, okay? Plessy versus Ferguson was a good example of this. States had different ways of interpreting it. There were some states that said this is definitely unconstitutional. Separate is not equal. Okay. Then there were some states, principally in the South, that said, oh, yes, it is. We're still providing the same services, but it just impacts groups differently. Okay. And some people began to challenge that. And that's one of those examples. It's going to take time. Okay. But if you think it's unfair and you don't want to obey it, you need to speak up. Okay. A judge who interprets what the legislation means is determining legislative intent. Okay. Be sure you get that turned down. When the judge or the court interprets what the legislature means, they are interpreting legislative intent. Okay. They are ruling. That's why we say the legislature makes the laws, the president enforces the laws, the courts interpret the laws. Okay. That's what they're doing when they make a ruling. Now, when you draft a bill, you need to consider important issues. Okay. For example, Even the simplest language might be misunderstood. Okay, it might not be understood correctly. All right. That being said, all right, you don't want to use overly flowery language. You want to try to use the simplest language possible so that everybody can understand. Realize, though, it still might be misunderstood. Okay. Legislation is often drafted and redrafted before being introduced and discussed in the legislature. Again, if it's an issue, and this is part of the time-consuming process, if it's an issue that we think is important, you want it to pass. Okay, I mean, let's be honest. You're not going to propose a bill thinking it's going to fail. You want it to pass. All right. So before you introduce it, a lot of times it goes through a lot of drafts because you want that thing passed. Okay. Courts will not enforce laws that are so vague that it is unclear exactly what conduct is being prohibited. Okay. And this is what's tricky. And this is one of the things that I wanted to bring up with your project. Okay. When you write bills, you want them to be understood by everybody. But at the same time, you want them specific enough so that everybody knows what is going on. Okay. You don't want them to be too vague so that people don't understand them. Okay. If there is a doubt to the meaning of the word in a criminal statute, the word must be strictly interpreted against the government. Okay, so when it comes to criminal law, because we are dealing with serious crimes and serious punishments, okay, if there is any question whatsoever, it is often interpreted against the government because you could be putting somebody's rights, somebody's freedom, somebody's very life at jeopardy if you don't. Okay, so it's interpreted against the government. Words are given their ordinary meaning by the court. Okay, there are no. Again, it comes back to interpretation. You want to use simple language that is understood. And I'm trying to think of an example of what a word could mean. Like murder is an example. Okay, murder is taking a life. All right, now what happened, okay, murder is actually a good example. Murder is the taking of a life by one person against another. Okay, the life of one person by another. All right, that's how you're going to interpret it. Now, what ends up happening is there are different degrees of murder. Okay, based on intent. All right, so murder is always going to be interpreted as loss of life, one person to another. But the intent and stuff like that, that will then qualify it first degree, second degree, accidental, etc., etc. Okay, so words are given their ordinary meaning by the court. Then it's up to the courts or it's up to the legislature to define the specifics. Okay, and that would be a good example of why you go through and you redraft things. Okay, I have a feeling that when we were talking about crimes involving murder, that the legislative bodies that were discussing them were drafting stuff a lot. Okay, what if it is an accident? What if it is not intentional? Okay, what if somebody did plan it out? Okay, what if somebody planned it out and then didn't actually go through with it? What do we call that? These sort of things go through the process when you're drafting a bill. Okay. Now, the bottom line is that you write in simple, clear English, not traditional legal language, not something that's over flowery, that people of an ordinary intelligence and education can understand what is expected. Okay? When you're proposing a bill, when you're creating a law, that's what you want to do. Be sure you get it down. You want to write in simple, clear English, not legal language, using common definitions so that people of an ordinary intelligence and education can understand what's going on. That's the bottom line when it comes to drafting a bill. Now, before you submit it, ask yourself these questions. Number one, is the law written in clear language? Will people understand it? Okay, in fact, that's question number two. Is it understandable? You need to answer specifics like when does it go into effect? as soon as the vote is taken or a year from now. Okay. Does the law contradict any other law? This is a big one, because if it does and it contradicts something that's protected by the Constitution, chances are it's not going to pass. Okay. So you got to be cognizant of the other laws that are out there, because if it contradicts something else, it might not pass. Is it enforceable? Okay. And if so, by whom? That's one of the things that you were working on in your group projects. Okay. Who's going to enforce the law? How are they going to do it? All right. And then what are the penalties for breaking the law, and are they clear and reasonable? That's what you guys were working on in that desert island project. That's some real life example. We do that all the time with the legislation that's passed by Congress and the state. Okay, we got to answer those questions. Is it enforceable? How's it going to be enforced? And what are the penalties for breaking the law? Okay. Now, that pretty much wraps it up for how laws are created. Okay, you begin with a bill. You want to be sure that it's written in a way that everybody can understand. Okay, so that once it gets passed, it can be easily enforced. Now, the last lesson for this week is we're going to move away from the legislatures. Okay, and we're going to talk about agencies and courts and how they play a role in lawmaking. And we're also going to take a brief look at international law. Okay, we tend to focus mostly in this class about national law and state law, but there are international laws out there that are supposed to apply to us as well. So we're going to look briefly at international law at the end of the next lesson.